Thank God the critical race theorists are on defense. They have taken a few good batterings recently from the valiant parents in America who have been rising up against critical race theory in their classrooms. The first defense being, oh, we're not teaching it there. Yeah, you are. Shut up. But good for the parents, good for the Republicans. Do not let up on this. Critical race theory is essentially racist. They can't frame anything without being racist and without framing it as if white people are the perennial oppressors of blacks. So don't let up. These people are racists, and you're not, and they recognize that you're not, incidentally. So this is an article that was written in Politico by one Gary Peller. Now, Gary Peller, I actually didn't bring the book over with me. It's on my desk. But the critical race theory, the writings that formed the movement, he's got essays in there. He is, in fact, the editor of that. The co-editor of Critical Race Theory, Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And this is the book I've been quoted from extensively. This is one of the originals. He's one of the founders of critical race theory. And so he, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown University Law Center, a white man, has come out to defend his, I was going to say baby, but maybe I should say abomination. So he says, some 25 states have already enacted or are considering laws to ban teaching what they call critical race theory, quote unquote, in public schools, a concept that school officials around the country deny they even teach. Well, if they're not even teaching it, there's no problem banning it, is there? Not a problem. Doesn't affect anything, apparently, Gary. So what are you crying about? A parents group in Washoe County, Nevada, wants teachers to wear body cams just to make sure. Based. And Ted Cruz just charged that critical race theory is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets. Good Republicans.
I'm sorry,
Good.
but his standard slips so far that teachers need to wear body cams like police to keep them accountable, so they're not teaching Nazism to kids.
Yeah, I mean, if I thought there was a significant chance they were going to teach Nazism to kids, I'd agree with that. So good on the parents. Because the parents are exactly right here. They are advocating for a colourblind form of society, whereas the critical race theorists want a society based on racial consciousness and collective guilt. So no, the good Republicans, bad Democrats. As a law professor closely associated with the critical race theory movement for more than 30 years, I am astonished. Yeah, I can't believe that the people are like, we don't want racism. Most academic work never gets noticed at all, and ours is being publicly vilified, even banned. Yes. While we wrote footnotes and taught our classes, did our ideas become the new orthodoxy in American society and the foundation of K-12 education as our critics charge? Hardly. It kind of has, though, actually, because there have been a large swathe of leftist teachers who have become indoctrinated into critical race theory, and they are going to teach from this position, with these assumptions, with these presuppositions. And that's not acceptable in a society that would like to move beyond racism. So there's just no other option. It has to be banned. And these teachers aren't allowed to teach from that perspective. And again, the same way that, Aryan German teachers shouldn't be teaching from the Nazi perspective in schools,
So, Myths has been doing a great job of getting the Zoom calls between teachers, just openly accepting that's how it comes to the classroom. If you did the same thing in Germany and you found federal school teachers who were talking in this language like, I bring the Nazism to the classroom. We don't explicitly teach about Mein Kampf, but, I separate the Jews from the Germans in the class or something. Then everyone would be like, no, that's fine. You're firing him right now.
Exactly. In fact, he says critical theory is not a racialist ideology. It's all it is. I mean, it's called critical race theory. It's all you talk about. But it's not a racialist ideology that declares all whites to be privileged oppressors, and CRT is not taught in public schools. No.
That's lies.
Both lies, yeah. It's
if it's not taught in schools, you wouldn't care.
I mean, like I said, I'm reading through the book now, and they're just constantly talking about, one of the essays I'm on now is currently talking about how, all of the academic scholarship in legal theory, in legal circles, it's white men citing white men, and they don't understand their privilege. And he literally says these exact words.
Imagine reducing all the philosophy and law to that.
Well, yeah,
there's all these different perspectives, all these traditions, all these different kinds of jurisprudence, like how you can think about stuff. Yeah. No, it's just white men citing white men.
Yeah. Well, that's what they've boiled it down to.
The entire decades upon decades of work.
Yeah. But saying, critical theory is not taught in public schools. Yeah, I mean, brilliant. But critical theory doesn't need to be taught for the consequences of critical theory to express themselves. It's like, it's literally like saying, we don't declare all Jews to be capitalist parasites, and we don't teach Nazism in schools. Now let's talk about how Jewish money is destroying the Reich. It's like, you've just adopted all of their assumptions. But over the last 9 months or so, first slowly in right-wing media conversation, and now quickly in state houses and even mainstream newspapers, conservative activists have branded all race reform efforts in education and employment as CRT, a disinformation campaign designed to rally disaffected middle and working class white people against progressive change.
Based. The only thing incorrect there is the misinformation part. But it's not misinformation.
Well,
it's true.
That's the thing. He's trying to establish a very, very narrow definition of what is critical race theory, as if critical race theory has no consequence when it's adopted by the teachers who will then go on to use it. But the reason that the lay ideology that is being described as critical race theory, and again, you doubtless find there are very, very, very fine distinctions. Like when you're talking to the communists and say, actually, I'm an anarcho-syndicalist. It's like, okay,
commie.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but I can accurately put all of this under the banner of communism, and in this case, critical race theory, because they're easy to spot because they use the same kind of language, they have the same kind of goals, and they rest on the same shared foundations. They all assume that America is a white supremacist project, that there is no such thing as a colorblind world or a colorblind republic, and that white people are oppressing black people. They all share these assumptions. If you understand what critical race theory actually is, though, and we'll get to that in a minute, it's easy to see that it has nothing to do with the cartoonish picture of reverse racism that critics depict. Right? The very fact that you use the word reverse racism shows that you're a critical theorist and not a normal person. And more importantly, CRT is a pretty good lens for understanding why the campaign against it has been able to spread so fast. It's also an inaccurate way of viewing it. As in, if you call the American Republic whiteness, and you say that the people who are interested in preserving the values of the American public are white, then you've now described that every person, black and white and Mexican and whatever, who's interested in preserving the impartial values of the Republic are now white. So it doesn't even work. So it's like, let's see, we can explain how all these people love whiteness because they're all white. Even the non-white ones. So that doesn't work.
But it's also
not a good way.
It's also a terrible lens because they'll just take the liberal standards, the Martin Luther King standards, being like colorblindness. That's white supremacy. So the reason they're opposing us is because they're white supremacists. That is his lens when he thinks about... When you look through critical race theory, you can see why there's so much opposition. No, I mean it's just such a distortion.
Well, it's just all the white supremacists coming up to defend their white supremacy, you see? That's how the critical race theorists view it, and that's obviously not the case. In their own terms, in fact, they believe in what they call a victim framework, whereas the Republicans believe in a perpetrator framework. And what this is just down to intention. It's exactly the same as the Chicago segment, right? Where it's like Lori Lightfoot is saying, well, no, the perpetrators, the people doing the shootings, are the victims of society. And the perpetrative framework is, as in, concerned about the intent of the perpetrator. The person pulling the gun, why did he do this? He's the person who did something wrong. So if you were someone who was, a white person, and you weren't going to hire that black person because they're black, then that's the perpetrator framework. You can identify the perpetrator, you can identify the intention, you can identify the consequence, and therefore there we have an example of racism. Whereas in Lori Lightfoot's view, the critical race theory view, it's just always and at all times and all places. And so there is no way that a black person can evade it, and of course this leads them into this perspective. But anyway, he carries on. Critical race theory in the real world describes a diverse work of a small group of scholars who write about the shortcomings of conventional civil rights approaches to understanding and transforming racial power in American society. And that very framing is the core reason why critical race theory is racism. They think that white people operate through the frame of racial power, and that's faulty. However, it is typical Democrat thinking. It's exactly how they always thought about it. It's always been concerned with racial power, whereas that's not how the Republicans think about things. He says, it's a complex critique that wouldn't easily fit into a K-12 curriculum. Even law students find the ideas challenging. We ourselves struggle to put it in understandable terms. We embrace no simple or orthodox set of principles, so no one can really be trained in CRT. Well, then there's no problem banning this discipline.
Hang on though, like he's very high-minded academicizing this whole thing. He's like, there's no way you could teach the whole complexes to K-12 education. You just go to TikTok and check out the SJWs of that age group. you can see it being simplified.
Yeah.
And it gets simplified to white's bad.
Yeah, but notice how he's just throwing every defense out he can, even where he contradicts himself. If you understand what CRT actually is, it's easy to see it's not the cartoonish picture. Okay, what's CRT? Well, we don't know. Even law students don't understand. We ourselves, the authors of critical race theory, are struggling to put it in understandable terms. We don't have any orthodox centered principles. No one can be trained in CRT. Then we should ban it on the
On the grounds that it's nonsense.
exactly, on the grounds that it's not a discipline. Like, it sounds like a fiction, Okay, well, if you've made this stuff up, you don't even understand it. How can you teach it? You grifters, But the absolute cope, it's like, oh, no. Oh, it's all embarrassing to watch, actually. Anyway, so this is what's called obscurantism, where you try to essentially define out of existence the thing that is being attacked. But the thing is, we buy their textbooks. We listen to lectures by their scholars. He himself is a scholar. And if he can't understand his own ideas, what right does he have to teach them? But this is, of course, pure lies. He's lying. He's lying to you. This would obviously be reason to ban this hokey pseudo-ideology if even the practitioners can't understand it. He says, the common starting point of our analysis is that racial power was not eliminated by the successes of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. That movement succeeded in ending the system of blatant segregation reflected in the whites only and coloured signs that once marked everyday life in America, but in its wake in the 70s and 80s, racial justice reform in countless institutions was halted by old guard resistance. Yeah. Maybe. But committing to the view of racial power is not going to help abolish the view of racial power. There's racial power everywhere. Maybe in the 70s, maybe, probably, in fact. How do we get rid of it? By committing to racial power. It's not going to work. It's not the way it works.
Just do the flip side of the coin.
Yes. What they're advocating for is, in fact, black supremacy over white supremacy. It's like, can we just have no supremacy? He continues, critical race theory was first articulated in the 1980s by a new generation of scholars who confronted this kind of racial power in universities we attended and the law schools we would eventually teach. As the American constitutional law embraced colorblindness as the ideal of racial justice, we focused on all the ways that racial power was exercised in supposedly colorblind ways. And this is down to interpretation. The race crits, of course, interpret everything through the lens of race and racial power. And if you've got a bunch of people saying, well, look, I'm not going to judge the world on the basis of racial power, and you have a bunch of people who are saying, I'm going to judge the world on the basis of racial power, they have a conflict of worldview. You can't, there's no reconciling this. And the most important thing as well is there are a number of other reasons that adequately explain circumstances that are just ignored by the lens of racial power. You can't explain how you end up with black billionaires if the white race are keeping the blacks down.
How do you end up with a black congresswoman?
How do you end up with a black president?
Doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, you can't account for these things. But he says, while we have a number of different approaches and beliefs, our shared goal, broadly speaking, I thought there was no one orthodoxy and was no one movement. How do you know what the shared goal of the critical race theory movement is when the race theory movement doesn't exist? Carrying on, the shared goal is to understand how those subtler racial power structures work, how they often pose as neutral institutions in law and society, and how to undo the injustices they've been causing. Total nonsense. Total nonsense. From the viewpoint of traditional liberal thinking, the problem of civil rights was that the policy of racial integration was never implemented strongly enough. But from a critical perspective, black students getting admitted into mainstream institutions wasn't enough to achieve racial equality because once inside the gates, they confronted norms organizing what was taught and how it was taught that had been created exclusively by whites operating in all-white institutions. Let's just assume that's true. Maybe that's true. Maybe there was, in the 80s, an aspect of that. And maybe there is an aspect of that now. Who knows?
Well, what I think he's mentioning there is that the colorblind worldview had been adopted, the Martin Luther King dream had been adopted, and that had been implemented in writing, but it was written by white people, therefore it's bad. You know,
not just
all
that.
White people wrote those rules saying you can't discriminate on the basis of race.
Sure, they did. But what he's complaining about is the sort of normative behaviours of the white people in these structures, apparently is some kind of barrier to black people. But the problem is, why is it only black people who seem to be encountering these problems? Why is this not a problem with Chinese, Indian, or Jewish pupils? Why is it not a problem for them? I mean, these are the three most successful ethnic groups in the United States and in Britain. Like, they do brilliantly.
Well, that makes them white.
Well, exactly. That's the thing. You now have to say, right, all of these groups are now white supremacists if they support the American Republic. You came to America for freedom, and you got it. You're a Nazi.
Yeah. In the same way the neo-Nazis just turn around and be like, yeah, that's because it's Jewish.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not an argument.
Exactly, it's not.
Like, this Indian guy's done really well. Yeah, Jew. It's like, what?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. Priti Patel, white supremacist. But this is the thing. Study hard, attend the classes, hand in your work on time, and these are all aspects of racial power. Ridiculous. There were, or could be, we've gone to, there were, oh no, well there might be. It is possible that there are racial power dynamics embedded even in what was called knowledge in academia, or neutrality in law. Well, I mean, we can't explain how the shaman calls the lightning. He's right, he's got us. Rather than seeing racism as an irrational deviation from rationality, we began to explore how liberal categories of reason and neutrality themselves might bear the marks of history and struggle, including racial and other forms of social power. And that all is based on the assumption that black people fall outside of the category of people who can engage in such concepts. That assumes that reason is some kind of tool outside of the black toolbox. Exactly, right? It's mad how this white professor is saying, well, listen, right? This reason stuff, thinking, using your old TikTok, Oh, well, I can think of a few communities who can't use those. And by the way, I'm a racist and you're a racist and everyone's a racist because you think like me. It's like, I don't think like you. I'm sorry.
Who's letting this homeless man?
Yeah, exactly. No, this is a professor of law, 30 years experience. One of the founders of the movement that's tearing apart the West.
Black people can't reason.
This is not the first time that this has been asserted by critical race theorists, and I doubt it'll be the last. Critical race theorists analyze social practices and the law as a social practice in terms of how they can help construct or maintain the subordination of the black community. That's how law works. Subjugating the black community. See, when you had Edward Coke and all these old English jurists, they were like, listen, we need to figure out how to oppress the blacks. So what blacks? It's like the blacks in America. What America? What are you talking about? Like, well, eventually the colonies will revolt, you see, and the slave class there will need to be oppressed by the laws. And so we in England, where we don't have any black people or any slaves,
I don't even know what a black person is.
Yeah, well, we may have had some idea, but like we need to.
The Romans have them.
Yeah, we need to construct a series of laws and legal institutions that the Americans can inherit, so in the future they can oppress the blacks. You don't get it, right?
Hell of a long game.
But the thing is, the subordination of the black community, he means the black race, right? And there's no reason that the black race can't flourish under the rule of law. In fact, I would suggest that it would be a good thing if they had the rule of law, as in if they weren't just allowed to shoot each other in the street, maybe their economic position and social position could improve.
Yeah, this is another great example of people, leftists in the United States never leaving the United States. Because, I mean, just think of all the ex-British colonies that have adopted rule of law, capitalism, and so on and so forth.
Common law, yeah.
And are successful. I mean, the success stories of Africa are ones that have accepted those principles.
Yes, because they are the principles that create a successful society. We reject colorblindness as an ideal because being conscious about race is the only way to tell whether the situation of the black community is improving or not. If we stop segregating the blacks, we might lose focus on the blacks. Is his argument, says the Democrat.
I don't know how these people are able to walk around in public.
I can't believe they aren't shamed on a daily basis. Tomatoes thrown at them. Like, get out, racist.
I mean, you think...
We won't be your slaves. I mean, I can't believe black people aren't just like, this guy's an evil.
Like, Andy No can't even go to, like, Portland or anything like that and just walk around. But the guy who's like, yeah, black people can't reason. Also teach everything that I think in schools. No one cares. Just able to do whatever.
Well, ironically, it's race consciousness that is preventing justice from being done in places like Chicago, London, and Birmingham, right? Because everyone who has the authority and the duty to do something about these degenerate communities is unable to because that would be racist. Oh, that would be racist. That would be racist. If it wasn't for race consciousness, we could say, right, What's happening? Well, in community X, doesn't matter who that community is, there have been 78 shootings in this one weekend. Send in the military. I mean, if that was happening in Chippenham or something, I'm like, why are the people of Chippenham shooting each other? Don't care, actually. Send in the military. Put them all in a boot camp. Send them off to our latest, war.
Well, no, you just put the lads on the streets to stop them shooting each other.
No, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably advocate a bit further. Look, if for some reason in Chippenham they are unable to
You're going to the Crimea, boys.
Yeah, well, yes. We didn't want to get enrolled. Well, that's too bad. Maybe you should have stopped shooting each other. Something has to be done. A firm hand has to be shown.
Charge of the Chipman Brigade.
Hey, there's nothing ignoble about that. The problem would be that they're committing all of these crimes. But anyway, as appealing as colourblindness might sound to some, it's also dangerous. It can lull decision makers wrongly to assume that once they no longer explicitly discriminate along racial lines in admissions or hiring, then racial power no longer plays a part in social life. Yeah. And it also means that if we stop obsessing about race, then this guy has no job.
Yeah. I mean, as the chat's pointing out, we are talking as if they want to end racism, whereas, as the guy says, racism is what he's selling.
That's a good point, yeah. I mean, ending racism is the end of this man's career.
Yeah.
Well, we reject colourblindness. Well, no kidding you do.
So when you come to him and you be like, yeah, I want to end racism, well, you should stop doing what you're doing. He's like, well, what happens to my house?
Oh, it's the meme, isn't it? Critical race theorists, southern plantation owners rejecting colourblindness. Well, that's literally what it is. Anyway, so he says, in thinking about police reform, a critical race theory perspective would focus on the historical relations between the community and the police, rather than simply on the idea of neutral enforcement of rules like probable cause requirements. But that's the problem, is the enforcement of the rules. Like, the historical relationship, like going back and say, so in 1780, the police and the black community had a really contentious relationship. Sure, how does that help the black mothers who are now burying their children?
In 2021.
Yeah. Anyway, and also it also completely misses the point, right? Because, and I don't know why I have to say this, but if there are 78 shootings in one weekend in a community, that community needs to change, right? This can't go on forever. It has to change. It comes from within the community, the ethics of the community, not something intrinsic to them. It's not about your biology. It's not about something the way you were made by God or anything. No, it's the way you've been raised and the things you think are acceptable to do. And these are not intrinsic. These are not unchangeable. These are things in which you have to make decisions and you have to decide to change your mind. That's the only way you can do. And if we can't address their day-to-day ethics, how can the community get any better without outside force, without authoritarianism? How can it get better? He says, the idea of imposing race-neutral standards of reasonableness on police is hollow in the actual context of white suburban police officers sealed off in high-tech patrol cars, patrolling the urban streets of black neighbourhoods. Well, why can't they just walk around like normal? Oh, because of the terrible crime in these communities from the degenerate gangs of drug dealers and pimps who have literally no concept of human decency. That's why. Like, you've allowed it to get this bad, and at this point, you're still being like, oh, well, it's the police's fault. Sorry, it's not. So I realise we're running out of time here, right? So I'm going to skip ahead because he said, complains that racialized police violence disappears when no racial statistics are kept on police interactions. Racial redlining looks at simple risk-based pricing if one doesn't look at racialized zip codes. The way to end racial subordination is to end it in fact, not to define it away. And the worst thing is like when you racialize police violence, it actually seems to disappear just when you record it. So we've got the Washington Post database where they are talking, if we can go to the next link, John, where they're talking about... They started this because of Ferguson, and they just started recording every time a police officer shoots someone. And it turns out in like 2015 there were like 27 shootings of police and of people who were unarmed, and so the 946 people or whoever it was that was shot that year, as they say, the vast majority of people shot and killed by police are armed.
What? As if that's meant to be a shock, like.
Yeah. Nearly 6 in 10 people were shot and killed by police had a gun. Many others were armed with a knife or other weapon. And so if you go through the database, you just find, was reaching for a gun, had a knife. And it's like...
It wasn't because of his skin tone.
No, it's because they had a weapon. And they were violent and they wouldn't surrender. But anyway, so I'm not gonna continue with the article because it is actually quite long, and I didn't think it takes so much time. But he finishes with, it's worth bearing in mind that what's really under attack right now isn't the boogeyman of critical race theory. It's the modest and long overdue change being ushered in by teachers and school administrators. So the practitioners of critical race theory who aren't teaching critical race theory and this having no effect on the classrooms. They may never have heard of critical race theory, but they intuitively understand why it exists and rightfully see the absurdity of conservative charge that teaching about racism itself is racist. But you aren't teaching racism. You're specifically teaching with the intention of changing, as in you're trying to undermine the American Republic. If you enjoyed this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full broadcast live every weekday at 1 p.m. UK time on lotuseaters.com.